Hello, friends. I am so happy to be here today with you. Wish we were in person. I think that's part of what we have to say now on Zoom, but I really, truly mean it. Um, I've been asked to talk about how to help our teams manage moral injury. And this is the first time I've actually put MDiv on my title. It is with a caveat, though, the asterisk, because the degree won't actually be awarded for about 2 weeks. But I have to acknowledge the Iliff School of Theology and so many of my professors, but especially Dr. Carrie Doring, who's an expert in this area, for informing how I think about this. And you'll be hearing a lot of what I've learned as I move through this topic with you. How I'm going to do that is starting, first of all, just with a discussion of what is moral injury and how do we recognize it and what are the degrees of it. I'm going to give you some tools and some ways to approach moral injury in our teams. And then I'm going to make a case that it's not just about managing this. We have to be intentional about trying to heal the injury in ourselves, in our teams, and in our society. So all of us have had issues during this pandemic of moral dissonance and dilemma and distress and injury. And so let's look for a minute at these different levels, if you will, and talk about what they mean. And the first and probably most important of these is to recognize that moral differences are part of being human. So this is a quote from Dr. Larry Graham's book, Moral Injury, Restoring Wounded Souls. And I'll be quoting from him quite a bit. But the needles on our moral compasses frequently point in different directions. Discovering our true north and following its course may clash with the true north on the moral compasses of our companions on the moral journey. So as we deal with moral injury, and we're doing this as a team, we will not all have the same true norths. Our compasses won't necessarily be pointing in the same direction. We're not going to see and understand the situation the same, and we may not agree on what the right or wrong thing is to do. So that's an important starting point. Moral differences become moral dissonance when it becomes stressful. But that's not bad, because this is the kind of stress that we know can increase function and output. If you will, it's the stress that leads us to that strategic inflection point where we recognize what's going on and we decide to stay with the status quo, or we intentionally move to a new paradigm. Dissonance becomes dilemma when we are required to choose and act against one moral good at the expense of another value we hold. Many of you had to confront moments during this pandemic where you had to make hard choices about limited resources and put protection of your team or caring for all your patients equally up against those limited resources and had to make hard decisions. That's a moral dilemma. Our hearts go out to our colleagues in India right now who are having to make the same choices about the limited resource of medical oxygen for the patients they're caring for. A moral dilemma is simply not knowing which to choose when presented with equally attractive or unattractive choices. And those dilemmas, in and of themselves, can lead to moral distress. Struggling with which of two equally good or bad choices you have to make can lead to distress. But more often, I think, in our everyday life, in our healthcare system, our moral distress is rooted in being unable, or sometimes even prevented, to do what we know is right for our patients. And that can lead to moral injury, which is the burden of harm and the diminishment of vitality that arises in individuals and communities when we or others violate our moral compasses. And again, importantly, for the world we live in health and the healthcare system we live in, it doesn't necessarily take big dilemmas to cause this, because moral injury can accrue from accumulated stress in morally dissonant environments, as much as from failure to act in accordance with one's own moral codes. And I think you would agree that we all have the experience of living in morally dissonant environments.
Is moral injury. Humans are moral, idealistic creatures that resonate love for other humans. And what happens when our moral ideals meet the real world, where we cannot give our patients the care we know that we could give if we had the tools and the resources and the autonomy to do it? What happens when we're trained in our schooling to give the best possible care to patients, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their race, regardless of their condition or their gender? But then we meet the real world, where it's all about the insurance company's bottom line. It's all about the hospital system's revenue. It's all about throughput and RVUs. And then we meet an electronic health record that is a glorified cash register with a little patient stuff tacked on. And we stare at that instead of staring at the vulnerable person who's having the worst day of their lives, and you can't be with them. How would that make anybody feel, let alone some of the most resourceful, resilient, passionate human beings on the planet are healthcare professionals?
So how do we approach this? What do we do? Let me start with 3 concepts that I think will maybe help us see a little more clearly, and at least a slightly different lens to view this view through. And the first is the difference between ethics and morality. Now, we all have studied medical ethics and we understand the premises, but it's not the same as morality. So ethics is based on values, which can be moral values, but focuses on rules, actions, and behaviors. So ethics asks the question in general, what's the right thing to do in this situation? Morality is more about the guiding principles. How do we know what's right? What constitutes right behavior and thought, and where did we learn it? Where did it come from? By moral, I mean the sense of right, fairness, and/or obligation that I feel in the events of my everyday life, including the core values and virtues held by my communities about what constitutes the best way to live. So let's talk about our community. If there's only one phrase, one concept you take from this talk, I hope it's this one. I am because we are. This is, in a way, a summary of the African philosophy or life view that's referred to as Ubuntu. I am because we are. We, in Western civilization, and all of us have been taught to be very individualistic, and that we have ultimate responsibility for our moral actions and our moral behavior and our choices. And yes, but I am because we are. There's a different way of viewing this, which is based in community. Our community is everyone you see in this circle and all the other people I forgot. All of these people who have chosen jobs, vocations, professions, work that allows us as a community to heal other human beings. I am because we are. You've already heard me talk about moral compasses, and it's an important tool. It's our own individual way of looking at the world. But compasses aren't always the best way to guide a journey. They do orient to the North Pole, to a fixed position, but they can only be used on a level surface when you're standing still. A gyroscope, on the other hand, can give you your orientation while measuring how fast you're turning and in what direction. And so a moral gyroscope may be a better metaphor for how we are going to track our journey through this moral terrain. And we all have moral gyroscopes. Our enculturated moral orientations comprise our internalized and habitual macrosystemic moral gyroscopes. But macrosystemic moral orientations are not only enduring, all the things we learned and from our faith traditions, our families, our communities, they are conflicted and unstable. They wobble, but here comes the important point, and they contend. So how do we take these concepts, these tools, and move toward healing moral injury? I think it is so important that we talk about healing moral injury because it is the core of the epidemic that we are experiencing right now in medicine. The number is usually given that 400 physicians die by suicide every year. We all know that it's much more than that. If you take the solo accidents that have no explanation, we know it's probably 3 times this, maybe 4. It is unacceptable. And if we just consider the deaths alone, that's enough. But when you take all the other suffering of everyone in our community, of everyone from nurses to clerical workers to everyone, it becomes even more tragic. We cannot become numb to this. We must remember that at the base of this epidemic of burnout and distress is moral injury. And the tool I think that will get us farthest in trying to deal with the moral injury is a tool called contextual creativity that has 4 steps. But before I get into that, I'm once again going to give you 3 concepts to get us into this idea. And the first is, how's the water?
There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?"
Every human being has a social location. It's defined by your age, your race, your gender, all kinds of things, everything you see here plus more. And every society creates a hierarchy of dominance of these social locations. So the dominant social location in the United States is white, under 60, cisgendered, male, born in the United States, heterosexual, and able-bodied. This is the water. If you are male, you do not perceive the water. Let me give you a very simple example. If we were in person or in any room like a surgery grand rounds, when a woman walks into the room, she is conscious, thinks about the fact that she is a woman. That does not happen to the men. You don't sit down in grand rounds and go, "Oh, I'm a man here." You just don't, because it's the water. It's the dominant assumed social location. And the important part of this is when you put yourself on this map and know your own social location, you then can begin to understand what you can't see. But the good news is that once you see the water, you can't unsee it. The second concept I want to give you is that of a palaver. Now, this is a word that's used very rarely and never with the historical meaning that I'm going to give you now, which is a long parley, a conversation between persons of different cultures or levels of sophistication. In other words, this is not a leader going in and leading a conference, developing a task force, creating a committee. This is a method of creating change, and I will offer moral change, that is received as a result of attentive living, rather than as something to orchestrate based on analysis and conviction. Now, when this slide went up, I'm sure you all went, what is she doing with beer on this slide? And who's this old white guy at the bottom? Well, this is a company, and this is George Taylor, who is the CEO of this company, that I think is one of the best examples of a palaver that I've ever heard. And it's new. George Taylor decided he wanted to do something about gang violence. And instead of creating a nonprofit, whatever, he took his skills as a businessman in his hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina, and he went to the police. And he said, I would like to meet with gang leaders. And they had a palaver. They basically were able to talk and discuss and figure out what their new moral existence was going to be. This is contextual creativity at its best, in order to create this new thing, this new moral way of being that was to the benefit of everyone.
But when opportunity strikes, we push forward. We're True Colors Brewing, and we're a group of gang leaders from the Bloods, Crips, and GDs. We come together for the good, and we mean business. True Colors Brewing, not your average beers, not your average brewers.
And the final concept I want to introduce, and although you know it, is moral courage. And I wish for all of you that you can get to the place where you can act from a sense of moral responsibility as leaders for the sake of values that transcend your personal values, your interests, and your projects. That you can lead teams into these new ways of seeing and new ways of discussing that actually will make changes. So what is this contextual creativity, and what are these 4 steps? So the first step is name it. This is sitting in those palavers with everyone in the community and with this open heart and open way of listening to find out, is this moral difference? Is it dissonance? Is it distress? Is it injury? And if you are in a position of social location that is dominant, it means you're listening. You name it, and then you frame it. Framing what we name is the basis for changing the power of the past. Naming alone is not enough. When we frame what we name in actionable and benevolent terms, we begin to gain the power to resist, change, and heal. My highlights, but this is not about reframing with words. This is not a discussion. It is benevolent action. I am because we are. And then we enact. Naming and framing alone are insufficient. We also must enact something new to engage ourselves and others in terms of the goals we envision in the reframing of our moral situation. I love etymology, and I was just so delighted to learn that enact actually comes from en, to make, and meaning. We tend to enact laws. This is not just action, this is enacting, making meaning. And I was trying to stay very, very somber about this, but I had this image that kept popping in my head when I was thinking about it, so I have to share it. This is about making it so. And then we don't stop, because this is an iterative process. There will always be outcomes from what we do and how we do it. The outcomes must be received, named, reframed, enacted, revised. And we continue this over and over again to build a moral community and become better as human beings and as a community. Well, I hope I have given you a tool of contextual creativity and perhaps some context to understand it better. And I am so grateful for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic with you. Thank you so much.